This retreat was an insight retreat, sometimes known as Vipassana. And I've been teaching a lot of Anapanasati, as you know. Meditation on the breath. So I've been teaching a lot of that lately. And insight meditation, or Vipassana, is not that dissimilar, but it's different enough. Both these practices have their base in the Satipatthana Sutta of the Buddha, the Four Foundations of Mindfulness. The insight retreat, the insight practice, there's a lot of different styles, but a lot of what you see nowadays is there are two main schools coming out of Burma. And one is the Uba Khin school, which is these days maybe known as Goenka. And both those teachers have passed away. That's the retreat centers that are very popular around the planet these days. And people go and they do very intensive practice. They do very intensive practice for 10 days. There's no live teacher at the retreat. Goenka ended up having this funny thing that he did. He recorded his talks, and at all the retreat centers, they play these recorded talks after specific days. Day 1 talk, day 2 talk, day 3 talk, day 4 talk, day 5 talk, and so on. So, and the other school is the Mahasi Sayadaw school. When you think of Joseph Goldstein and Jack Cornfield and Sharon Salzberg and IMS and Barry, which was kind of ground zero for the explosion of the mindfulness meditation in the West, they were students of Mahasi Sayadaw. Although they had all done retreats with Goenka as well. But back in those days, he was alive, so he was a real person and not a disembodied voice from a tape. The retreat that I taught was kind of a and the other main school, you know, if you can call it, is the Thai forest tradition, but they don't call it insight practice. But from the Thervadian tradition, once again, based on the Satipatthana Sutta, and in the Thervadian tradition, it's one of the main schools that have influenced practitioners in subsequent schools in the West. So I employed techniques from both the Mahasi Sayadaw practice and the Goenka, or the Uba Khin practice. With the Uba Khin / Goenka practice, the main thing that we use, and it's a very powerful practice, is to scan the body. So you start at the top of your head and you move through your body. And you're aware of sensations. The classic approach in Goenka courses is you practice mindfulness of breath for 3 days, and then you open up your attention to mindfulness of sensation. And I plan over the next few weeks to kind of spend a little bit more time on these practices. Yeah. So there's that technique of scanning the body. And, you know, the idea of like insight practice is to open us up to the truth of what our experience actually is. And there's 3 main characteristics according to the Thervadian teaching is impermanence. All experience, all phenomena is impermanent. All experience is unsatisfactory or suffering because it's based on impermanence. And there is no permanent self that you can point to. So the purpose of the insight, the purpose of the Vipassana practice is to explore through these various techniques these truths. But what happened is these truths become apparent. They're not something that we make up from our practice, but they're, as we gain concentration and focus and subtlety in our viewing of the formations of the body and the mind, we begin to see for ourselves, we begin to have a direct experience of impermanence, of the suffering inherent or the unsatisfactoriness inherent, and the idea or the experience that there is no discernible permanent self. And in some ways, you could say it all hinges on impermanence, right? Because in each moment, there's a rising and passing away. And there's nothing that you can find within the content of mind, thought, feeling, emotion, and body. There's nothing you can point to that is self. So the insight practices in the Thervadian tradition all lead to the experience and the contemplation of these three characteristics of life. So I started with a Goenka, the scanning of the body, and the main in the Mahasi Sayadaw technique, one of the main, one of the most notable characteristics is noting. And I've used this in some of my teachings as well. So you note, so you start with the breath, and you either watch the breath in the abdominal area, the chest, or the nostrils, and you watch if it's in the chest or the abdominal area, you're with the rise and fall, and you actually note the rise and fall. So and if it's in the nostrils, then you note the in-breath, the out-breath. So we start with this practice of noting, and then we open it up to, as I referenced in the beginning, we open it up to the four foundations of mindfulness, if you will. So we open it up to the entirety of our experience. So we open it up to mental content, we open up to emotional states, and we open it up to physical, to sensation. So the idea in Vipassana insight practice is that we develop enough concentration just to be with a moment-to-moment experience. The Anapanasati is it begins by developing calm, and you could say with the Vipassana it does too, because we're watching the breath. But the Anapanasati puts a lot more focus on just developing the calm than the focus on the concentration. And it is actually used. There are other practices that are deep concentration practices, and the Anapanasati often is used in conjunction with those concentration practices. So with the Vipassana, and so with the Anapanasati, and you just stay with the breath, so you're staying with one object. And then at some point you do, towards the end of the final stages of the Anapanasati, you open it up to the insight practice. But the insight practice itself, we watch the breath for a while, and then we open our awareness up either to sensation in the body or just the entirety of our experience. So we are with whatever comes up. So you watch the breath, and then there's a thought, and you note it. you know thinking. There's a sound, you know hearing. There's a feeling, you know feeling. So we use this practice of noting to slow the mind down. And it's a really effective practice, actually. And once the mind is calmer and is able to be very present with what's actually coming up, then we drop the noting. So the noting is an essential part of the Mahasi Sayadaw Vipassana practice. In the Goenka style, we are just going from breath right to sensation in the body and just staying with that. We're not doing the rest of the Satipatthana. We're not watching the mind. I mean, we're watching it as far as that we know if the mind wanders, we bring it right back to sensation or right back to breath. But in some ways, you could say that the Goenka technique is solely focused on the first part of the four foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta. It's solely focused on sensation. The Mahasi Sayadaw technique opens you up, and in my mind, it's more aligned with the Satipatthana, and it's more aligned with the teaching of the Buddha, is that we use all these foundations of mindfulness to investigate our experience. So we're aware of feeling, we're aware of mental states, we're aware of thought, we're aware of actually, so that's the things in the mind, but we're aware of all of we work with all of the perceptions from the five sense doors. So anything that you're experiencing becomes a moment of watchfulness, becomes a moment of awareness. And then the idea is, you know, once you have enough calm, once you're settled in enough, that you are just being with your experience. And you are not reacting to anything, but simply observing. And through that ability to observe from that calm, present state, then insight, seeing into, starts to develop. In the context of a retreat situation where we're doing a lot more practice, then we can get pretty deep pretty quick and start to experience all of these processes in insightful ways, let's say. So that's the overview of the insight practices. A lot of my teaching is inclusive of the insight practices, because that's where I did my majority of practice for the first couple of decades. And then if you move into the Tibetan, into the Vajrayana traditions, into the higher teachings of Mahamudra or Dzogchen, they're basically insight practices too, but you're working on in a little bit of a different way, but it all comes down to watching our experience and investigating our experience. In Zen as well, you know, you could say that Zen practice is insight practice. They are developing calm and then looking very, very deeply into the experience. So all of these teachings, all of these schools actually have at their root the four foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana Sutta. And as it traveled through the experience of different practitioners and as it traveled through geography, over geography, through geography, and time, then these kind of more specialized practices developed. But essentially, we are training the mind to look at itself. So we come to a point, which is the point that I kind of left the last classes at, we come to the point where we're looking at awareness itself. So the initial training is to look at the objects of mind, to look at the object of our experience. But when the mind gets steady and quiet enough, at some point, our attention, if we're looking at your hand, your attention turns to not just being mindful of seeing the hand, but you turn your attention to the awareness itself, that which is aware of this seeing. So that's where all the practices lead. And Vipassana at some point is no different. There's a point where they might not use the same language, but there's a point where the mind gets very penetrative into the present moment, and it sees into that experience very, very deeply. And it comes to the point where the mind sees itself and it stops. It sees the creator and it stops. And that leads to a very, very deep, that leads to very profound insight, even if it flashes for only a moment. So over the course of these next group of classes, I would like us to work a little bit with some of these techniques, working with the body, the scanning of the body, as well as with noting. Working with that for a while and see what comes from that. So you could say, continuing on from what we practice in the retreat. There's also a teacher in Burma who teaches a style of vipassana where you don't work on the focus or the concentration so much, like just trying to stay with the breath. And his point is just really working on observation, watching, the watching, the watching, the watching, the watching. And for a practice in daily life, that's really, it's a good point. But I still maintain that we need to develop a certain amount of samadhi, a certain amount of focus to help slow down. I use these four terms during the retreat, and I found them quite a useful tool for teaching. So these four terms are arriving, observation, opening, and being. And you could put all of that teachings into those 4 steps. So I talked about it in the context of the retreat, but really you could talk about it in the context of the present moment as well. So the first stage is to arrive, is to be here. And then we observe what's taking place. So we observe the body, we observe the feelings in the body, the sensations in the body. Are you comfortable, uncomfortable, tight, loose? But we also observe the mind. And a really useful thing to observe is the mental state. So we observe thought, but what's the underlying mental state? Irritation, joy, anger, dullness, sleepiness, jealousy, compassion. It's really good to name, and once again, we're going to include the naming in this, is to name it, and name the mental state that you're in the moment. When you wake up in the morning and your day is starting, and there's probably certain types of thoughts that you have in the first hour of the day, certain pet tapes that we play over and over again. What's the state? Name the state. Name the mental state. That's really bringing mindfulness to the situation. So we observe, right? We arrive. We're sitting at the breakfast table, having our tea or coffee. We bring ourselves there, and then we observe. How's the body? How's the mind? How's the emotions? What's the mental state? And then what we do is we open up to that experience. When we're just working with the breath in the beginning, right? We're coming back, we're letting these things go, we're coming back to the breath again and again and again. But once we're present and we're with what's taking place, we can just open with it. So what does it mean to open with the experience? Well, it means to be open to what's taking place, not resisting it, not wishing it was something else, but just to open to what that experience is. Try it. It's hard work. You're feeling sick, right? You're feeling sick. I bet you wish you weren't feeling sick. But, and of course you do, but the body will heal itself. You'll feel better at some point. Or your back hurts, or your head hurts. But what if we're just open to it? Meaning that we're not constricting around it. We're just allowing it to be. We're just allowing that experience to be. And that's the next step, is the being. So we open up to it, we allow it in, and then we just be with it. So we're not lost in thought. We're not watching our breath. We're being with the experience. We're arriving, we're watching, observing, we're opening to it, and then we're just being. And when we do this, it leads us to that experience where we can sit and we are able to be with that awareness. if the teacup, if this cup is a content of your mind, if we just accept it, if we just accept the mental state, if we accept whatever's going on in our head or whatever's going on around us, if we accept it, then there's an equanimity that's there. There's a peacefulness that's there. There's a calmness that's there, right? And then from that place, the content of the mind is not so important anymore. And we start to sense the awareness. And when we start to sense that, we're really opening up to mystery. We're opening up to the unknown. We're opening up to that part of ourselves that is quite vast and not just contained in the cup. Which is, if you're wondering, it's green tea. Zenru brought me back some really nice green tea from Japan. He said, "What would you like from Japan?" And I said, "It's green tea." So we observe, we open, and then that sense of being, that state of being in that state, we are with the awareness itself. I think everybody can follow that, right? That you can follow the logic of all that. So the next thing is to practice it. But the thing about this is that it's there all the time, right? So when we are sitting in our chair, looking out the window, when we are waking up and lying in bed or going to sleep, when we are moving through our day, that awareness is always there. And that becomes the practice. So the insight retreats, the insight practices / Satipatthana practices are to bring us to this point. Are to bring us to this point. The Anapanasati practice is for the development of calm. But at some point, so the difference between what they say is in the traditional language, it's samatha and vipassana. So they say there's basically two kinds of meditations in the Buddhist world. One is samatha, calm, and the other is vipassana. The Anapanasati is more samatha, but samatha turns to insight, turns to vipassana, just when we open ourselves up to the experience. When we're deep concentration, there's not that much awareness. You become aware of one single point and nothing else. But we're not going that deep. We're going, it's called access concentration. We're becoming concentrated enough, calm enough, just to be able to truly arrive at the present moment. And you know the feeling, right? You know the feeling. When the mind isn't racing anymore, and there's just a certain degree of tranquility and a sense of stableness in the mind. So in these practices, the samatha, the calm, leads to the insight. The samatha leads to the vipassana. The unfortunately, the Goenka retreats have I just kind of heard about it during this retreat, but some people are scared when they hear about vipassana or they hear about insight practice, because there are people that go to those retreats and they don't have good experiences, and sometimes they have very bad experiences, like psychotic breakdowns. I was talking to a nurse in the retreat, and she said, I was scared to do a vipassana retreat because they can be very, very intense. And since Goenka didn't designate any teachers in his lineage, then you don't have people there. You have people there who are meditation technicians, if you will, but I'm not sure how much wisdom they have, how much understanding they have. So it's a little bit tricky. So if you hear the word insight, if you hear the word vipassana, and somebody says I've done a vipassana retreat, it could mean very different things. And the style that I like to teach in is a much more relaxed style. I've done a lot of the very intensive work, and I think it has its place. But certainly when you're giving courses in the West or weekend or week courses, you don't want to go into that deep of intensity. And what you find with practitioners is there are those who have more of a proclivity towards concentration, and then that deepness naturally unfolds on its own, or that intensity naturally unfolds on its own. But I don't think it's something that we should force ourselves into.